What would you do if your father handed you the keys to an empire, but only under one shocking condition? Imagine being the heir to a multi-million-dollar business, groomed your whole life for success, only to have your father throw an impossible curveball, marry a garbage collector, or walk away from the fortune. The Thompson estate stood as a testament to the luxury and power of New York's high society. With its sprawling gardens, intricate marble fountains, and grand hallways adorned with art worth millions, it was the epitome of wealth, a world so detached from the everyday struggles of the common man. Edward Thompson, the man behind this empire, was known not only for his financial acumen, but also for his perseverance and unyielding principles. But as he gazed out from his office window, watching his son's sports car pull up the driveway, a sense of unease crept over him. Daniel Thompson, his only child, had been raised amidst opulence, never needing to worry about making a living or facing rejection. The young man's mindset had become a stark contrast to his father's values. Edward prided himself on his hard-fought success, starting from scratch and working his way up in a ruthless business market. He had once been a man of humble beginnings, living in a small apartment with dreams of owning a house someday, but his son seemed to lack that hunger. "Dad, I'm back," Daniel's voice echoed through the marble halls as he entered, his designer suit and confident stride exuding entitlement. He'd just graduated from one of the most prestigious business schools in the country and was ready to dive straight into the wealth his father had built. But the elder Thompson wasn't so easily swayed. "Come in, son," Edward called out, his tone measured. As Daniel stepped into the expansive office, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a view of the city skyline, Edward could see the disinterest in his eyes. The younger Thompson's gaze flickered impatiently, skimming over the relics of hard work and legacy, items that should have inspired respect. Instead, Daniel's mind was fixated on the next car he wanted to buy or the market opportunity he'd seize. "You look good, Dad," Daniel remarked casually, though his tone lacked sincerity. He leaned back in one of the plush leather chairs, crossing his arms as if waiting for a quick congratulation on his graduation, and more importantly, his smooth entry into the family business. Edward sighed inwardly. How had things gone so wrong? He'd hoped sending Daniel to the best schools, surrounding him with the brightest minds, and exposing him to a world of possibilities would ignite the same passion and resilience that had driven him. Yet all he saw now was a young man blinded by privilege, a mind shaped by comfort rather than hardship. "Daniel," he began slowly, carefully choosing his words, "I think we need to talk about your future." Daniel's brow furrowed, the first sign of unease cracking his facade. "What do you mean? I'm ready to start working in the company," he replied, an edge of defensiveness creeping into his voice. I said a lot of things," Edward interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "But what I see in you now worries me, son. You've spent too much time focusing on wealth, on material things, without understanding the true value behind them." The younger Thompson shifted in his seat, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "So what? Isn't that the whole point? You built this empire, so I wouldn't have to worry about the things you did, so I could live comfortably. Isn't that what every father wants for his child?" Edward leaned forward, the intensity in his gaze startling his son. "Comfort is a privilege, Daniel, but it's not a given, and it's not something you just inherit. You have to earn respect, earn trust, no matter how much money or how many houses you own." Daniel fell silent, staring at his father as if he were speaking a foreign language. Edward had never been this stern, this direct with him before. There was always an understanding that Daniel would take over the business, but now, for the first time, it felt as if that certainty was slipping away. "So, what are you saying?" he asked slowly, trying to mask the anxiety rising in his chest. Edward stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow over his son. "I'm saying," he said quietly, "that if you want a place in this company, if you want to be more than just a spoiled rich kid with a title, you're going to have to change." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, Daniel felt a pang of something unfamiliar. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was doubt. For all his bravado, he'd never considered that his father might see him as anything less than an equal. "What do you want me to do then?" he demanded, his voice tight. "Start at the bottom? Sweep the floors? What's the lesson here, Dad? Humiliate me until I What? Appreciate the value of $1? He scoffed, shaking his head. Edward remained unfazed. It's not about money, it's about character, he said softly. And right now, yours is lacking. Daniel stared at him, the impact of those words hitting harder than he expected. So what? You're going to cut me off? He challenged, a mix of fear and anger swirling in his chest. Throw me out on the street? What are you trying to prove? Edward met his gaze steadily. No, he replied, but I am going to make sure you understand what it means to live without privilege, to see the world from the ground up, because until you do, I can't trust you to lead this company or handle the responsibilities that come with it. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Daniel's mind whirled. What was his father planning? A sinking feeling settled in his gut. For the first time in his life, he felt uncertain, unsure of the ground beneath his feet. What exactly are you saying? He repeated, his voice quieter now. Edward leaned back, a strange look of sadness and resolve in his eyes. I'm saying, he murmured, that if you want to prove yourself, you're going to have to do it on my terms, and it's going to be a lot harder than you think. The tension in the Thompson household was palpable the next morning. Daniel woke up to find a letter on his bedside table, a simple note from his father that read, "Meet me in the study." With a heavy sigh, he got dressed and made his way through the grand corridors, his footsteps echoing off the polished floors. As he entered the room, Edward was already seated, a stack of papers in front of him, and a contemplative expression on his face. "Sit down, son," he said, his voice calm but firm. Daniel hesitated, then dropped into the leather chair across from his father, crossing his arms defensively. "What's all this?" he asked, eyeing the documents warily. Edward leaned back, his gaze steady. "A contract," he replied, "and a condition." "A condition?" Daniel echoed, disbelief tinged with anger. What condition? He had expected some sort of test, maybe a managerial role in one of the smaller branches, or a project that would prove his capabilities. But the look on his father's face told him this was something far more serious. Edward took a deep breath. "If you want any claim to the family business, you're going to have to follow through with what's in this contract." He slid the stack of papers across the desk. "Read it." With a scowl, Daniel picked up the first page, skimming over the lines. His frown deepened as he read further, his eyes widening in shock. "You want me to—" "What?" He looked up, incredulous. "Marry someone you choose? Are you out of your mind?" Edward remained unflinching. "It's not a matter of marriage, Daniel. It's a matter of character." He leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "You've spent your whole life surrounded by wealth, by people who cater to your every whim. But you've never known what it's like to build something real, to stand by someone when there's nothing but hard work and hope to rely on." Daniel shook his head, his hands clenching around the paper. "This is insane. You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," Edward replied evenly. "And if you refuse, you'll walk away from this house and this business with nothing but the clothes on your back." Silence fell as Daniel stared at his father, stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "And who exactly am I supposed to marry?" he demanded, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Some heiress you've lined up for me?" Edward's gaze softened just for a moment. "No," he said quietly. "Her name is Sarah. She's a garbage collector." Daniel froze, his mind struggling to process the words. "A garbage collector?" He laughed, the sound harsh and disbelieving. "Is this some kind of joke? You want me to marry a—" "Yes," Edward interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "She's a hard-working woman who supports her ailing mother. She has more strength and integrity in one day's work than most people show in a lifetime." Daniel's laughter died in his throat. He stared at his father, trying to read his expression, searching for any sign that this was a twisted prank. But Edward's face was set in stone, unyielding. "You're serious?" he whispered. Edward nodded. "You'll marry Sarah, and you'll live with her under her circumstances for 1 year. No help from me, no access to your trust fund, your cars, your properties, just the life she leads every day." Daniel felt the room spin around him. Marry a garbage collector? Live in, what, a rundown apartment? He opened his mouth to argue, but Edward held up a hand. "This isn't up for negotiation," he said quietly. "Either you agree to this, or you walk out of here with nothing." Anger surged through Daniel like wildfire. How dare his father try to control him like this? "You can't force me to—" "I'm not forcing you to do anything," Edward cut him off sharply. The choice is yours. But if you want any part of this business, if you want to prove that you're more than just a spoiled kid living off my success, then you'll do this, and you'll do it right. Daniel's breath came in short, furious bursts. Why her? He demanded, his voice shaking. Why not someone else? Someone who at least... Because... Edward interrupted again, his gaze unwavering. I know you. I know your pride, your ego, and if you can learn to respect someone like Sarah, someone who has none of the things you take for granted, then maybe there's hope for you yet. The words cut deep, and Daniel recoiled as if struck. He wanted to storm out, to reject the ridiculous ultimatum and never look back. But a small, insistent voice whispered in the back of his mind, what if he's right? What if he really did need this? Shaking his head, he tried to banish the thought. Fine, he bit out. I'll do it, but don't think for a second that I'm going to enjoy this charade. Edward's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his expression remained serious. It's not about enjoyment, Daniel. It's about growth. He pushed the contract forward. Sign it, and we'll set up a meeting with Sarah tomorrow. With a glare that could melt steel, Daniel snatched up the pen and scrawled his name at the bottom of the contract. There, he spat. Happy now? Edward's gaze softened just a fraction. You'll thank me one day, he murmured. Daniel snorted. Don't hold your breath, he muttered, shoving the papers back across the desk. This is going to be a disaster. Edward watched him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We'll see, he said quietly. We'll see. The next morning, Daniel found himself standing outside a modest brick building on the edge of the city. It was a far cry from the gleaming skyscrapers and polished penthouses he was used to. He glanced at his watch impatiently, then looked around. There were no limousines, no chauffeurs, just the hum of early morning traffic and the distant rumble of garbage trucks. And then he saw her, a petite woman in worn overalls and a baseball cap, her face flushed from the cold, pushing a heavy garbage bin down the sidewalk. Sarah. She glanced up, her eyes widening slightly as she took in his expensive clothes and the scowl on his face. You must be Daniel, she said, her voice wary but polite. Daniel forced a tight smile. And you must be Sarah, he replied stiffly. Guess we're stuck with each other, huh? Sarah's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, amusement maybe, in her eyes. Looks like it, she said simply. So, are you ready to get your hands dirty? Daniel opened his mouth to retort, then closed it again. This was it, the life he'd agreed to. For 1 year, he squared his shoulders, swallowing his pride. Lead the way, he muttered. Sarah nodded, and together they began their first day as husband and wife. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Each morning, Daniel found himself waking up in the cramped one-bedroom apartment he now shared with Sarah. The walls were thin, the plumbing unreliable, and the constant buzz of the city outside their small window was a far cry from the peace and luxury he had been accustomed to. At first, he despised every minute of it. He made little effort to hide his disdain, barely speaking to Sarah, except when necessary, treating their shared life as if it were some distasteful obligation. But Sarah never complained. She'd get up before dawn, brew a cheap pot of coffee, and start her long day, pushing through the grueling hours with a quiet strength that baffled Daniel. One rainy evening, after a particularly grueling shift, she returned drenched and shivering, yet still managed a small smile when she saw him. Rough day? She asked lightly, stripping off her soaked jacket and hanging it to dry. Daniel glanced up from the book he wasn't really reading. Why do you put up with this? He blurted out, his frustration bubbling over. You work like a dog for pennies. What's the point? Sarah paused, then shrugged, her expression thoughtful. It's not about the money, she said softly. It's about the people I love, my mom, our neighbors, everyone who's depending on me. She looked at him directly, her gaze unwavering. You do what you have to do when people are counting on you. Her words struck a chord in Daniel. He'd spent his whole life thinking about wealth and status, never once considering what it meant to work for something bigger than himself. The realization unsettled him, and he found himself watching Sarah more closely after that. He began to notice the little things, the way she'd hum softly while scrubbing out garbage bins, the way she'd always have a kind word for the elderly couple in their building, the way her face would light up whenever she mentioned her mother. One cold night, when the heater broke down, they sat huddled together under a pile of blankets. It was the first time they'd been this close. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, unsure what to say. I could get it fixed, he muttered. I have some money left. No, Sarah cut in gently, shaking her head. We'll manage. Besides, it's not so bad. She smiled, a teasing glint in her eye. You get used to it after a while. He stared at her, incredulous. You can't be serious. This place is falling apart. It's home, she replied simply, and for a moment, Daniel felt something crack inside him. How could she be so content with so little? It didn't make sense. The thought haunted him as the days wore on, nagging at the edges of his mind. Then, one fateful afternoon, Daniel caught a fever. It started as a dull ache, but by evening, he was burning up, too weak to get out of bed. Sarah didn't hesitate. She took one look at him, then ran to the nearest pharmacy, paying out of pocket for medicine and supplies. For the next 3 days, she stayed by his side, wiping his brow, coaxing him to drink water, murmuring words of encouragement. Her face was pale with worry, dark circles forming under her eyes from lack of sleep. You're going to be okay, she whispered over and over, her hand cool against his fevered skin. Just hang in there, okay? Daniel was delirious, slipping in and out of consciousness, but he could feel her presence, steady, unyielding, a lifeline in the haze of pain and fever. When he finally recovered, he woke to find her slumped in a chair beside the bed, fast asleep, exhausted, drained, and still there. Something shifted in him then. Watching her sleep, her face peaceful despite the toll the past few days had taken, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Gratitude, respect, maybe even affection. He reached out, hesitated, then gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. She stirred, blinking blearily at him. Hey, she murmured, her voice hoarse. How are you feeling? Better, he whispered, his throat tight. Thanks to you. Sarah smiled faintly, then tried to sit up, only to wince as her back protested. Don't thank me, she said softly. It's just what you do when someone's in need. Daniel stared at her, speechless. No one had ever cared for him like this before. Not his friends, not his ex-girlfriends, not even the staff at his father's mansion, who catered to his every whim out of obligation. Not genuine concern. But Sarah. She didn't have to stay. She didn't have to care. And yet she had. Even when he'd been nothing but cold and dismissive to her, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Why? He whispered. Why are you being so nice to me? Sarah looked at him, her gaze gentle and knowing. Because, she said softly, everyone deserves kindness, even when they don't see it in themselves. Daniel's chest tightened painfully. He looked away, unable to hold her gaze. You're incredible, you know that. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Sarah laughed softly, the sound light and airy, like a breath of fresh air. Hardly, she murmured. I'm just stubborn. But Daniel shook his head slowly. No, he insisted. You're the strongest person I know. From that day forward, something changed between them. Daniel began to help out more around the apartment, picking up groceries, fixing the leaky faucet, even cooking a few disastrous meals that had Sarah in stitches. He accompanied her on her morning shifts, working alongside her as they hauled garbage bins and swept up the city's debris. It was grueling, back-breaking work, but for the first time, Daniel didn't feel resentment. He felt pride. Pride in the honest labor, in the camaraderie he shared with the other workers, in the way Sarah's face would light up with surprise and admiration when he managed to keep up with her pace. Their small, dingy apartment became more than just a place to sleep. It became a home. They started having dinner together, talking late into the night about everything and nothing, about their pasts, their fears, their dreams. Daniel found himself opening up to her in ways he'd never done with anyone else. He told her about his mother's death when he was young, about the pressure of living up to his father's expectations, about the loneliness of wealth and status. And Sarah listened, really listened, without judgment or pity. In turn, she shared stories of her own struggles, of the nights she'd spent worrying about bills, of the sacrifices she'd made for her mother, of the dreams she'd given up on long ago. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Daniel's old friends showed up unannounced. They laughed at the sight of him in his work clothes, sneering at the modest apartment and the garbage girl he was living with. Fury and shame twisted in Daniel's gut, but as he glanced at Sarah, standing there quietly with her head held high, something snapped. You know what? He said coldly, stepping forward. Get out! If you can't see the value of the woman standing in front of you, then you're the ones who don't belong here. His friends gaped at him, stunned, but Daniel didn't care. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he stood. "She's worth more than all your money and mansions put together," he said fiercely. "And if you can't respect her, then you can't respect me." When they finally left, Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide and shining. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. Daniel took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "Because," he said softly, "I love you." The words hung in the air, raw and unexpected. For a long moment, Sarah just stared at Daniel, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, struggling to find the right response. "You, what?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel took a step closer, his heart hammering in his chest. "I love you, Sarah," he repeated quietly, the intensity in his gaze making her breath catch. "I know I've been a complete jerk. I know I don't deserve your kindness or your patience. But somewhere along the way He paused, searching for the right words. "You changed me. You showed me what it means to be strong, to be selfless, to really care about someone." Sarah blinked rapidly, her hands trembling slightly. "But you don't have to say that," she murmured, looking away. "I mean, we're only here because of my father's ridiculous condition," Daniel finished, his tone bitter. He reached out, gently taking her hand. "Yeah, that's how it started. But it's not why I'm here now. I could have walked away a dozen times. I could have given up, gone back to my old life." He squeezed her hand gently, willing her to look at him. "But I didn't, because I didn't want to leave you." Her gaze snapped back to his, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for a lie. But all she saw was sincerity, raw, unguarded sincerity that took her breath away. "Daniel, I know you don't believe me," he interrupted softly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I can't blame you. I was awful to you in the beginning. But these past few months, they've been the best of my life. Not because of the work, or the apartment, or any of that, but because of you." Sarah felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "You don't mean that," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're just saying it because I'm in love with you." Daniel cut in firmly. "And I don't care if you believe it right now. I just needed you to know." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken words and emotions. Finally, Sarah took a shaky breath, pulling her hand free from his. "I can't do this, Daniel," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I can't be some lesson for you, some experiment." Daniel's heart dropped. "You're not." "But I am," she insisted, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You don't belong here. You don't belong with me. You're rich and powerful," and she trailed off, frustration and pain warring in her eyes. "And I'm just a garbage collector." Daniel took a deep breath, then shook his head slowly. "No," he said softly, "you're the woman I love, and I don't care if I'm rich or poor or anything in between. None of it means a damn thing if I can't be with you." He stepped closer, gently cupping her face in his hands. "Please, Sarah," he whispered, "just give me a chance. Give us a chance." For a long moment, Sarah didn't move. She just stood there, staring up at him, her eyes brimming with uncertainty and fear. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she shook her head. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't be with you, Daniel. Not when I know you're going to go back to your old life the moment this is over." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "I'm not going back," he said fiercely. "I don't want that life anymore. I want you." But Sarah just looked at him, sadness and resignation in her eyes. "You say that now," she murmured. "But what happens when this year is up? When your father's test is over? And you can have everything back? What then?" Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing. I'll stay," he stammered desperately. "I'll give up the company, the money, everything." "No, you won't," Sarah said softly, "because that's not who you are, and I can't ask you to change for me." A tear slipped down Daniel's cheek, the first one he could ever remember shedding in front of someone. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, don't push me away." But Sarah just stepped back, shaking her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I have to go." And with that, she turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving Daniel standing there, his heart shattered. For hours, he stayed rooted to the spot, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. He'd thought she felt the same, but maybe he was wrong. Maybe she really didn't want him. The days that followed were a blur. Sarah didn't come home. She stayed with a friend across town, leaving Daniel alone in the small apartment that now felt emptier than ever. He went through the motions, working, eating, sleeping, but everything felt hollow, colorless. Without her, nothing mattered. One evening, as he was dragging himself up the stairs, a familiar figure appeared at the door. "Edward, what the hell are you doing here?" Daniel growled, exhaustion and grief sharpening his tone. Edward just looked at him calmly. "I came to see how you're doing," he said quietly, "and to offer you a way out." "A way out?" Daniel repeated, disbelief flaring. "What, are you here to say, 'I told you so'? To gloat that I failed your stupid test?" Edward's expression softened slightly. "No, son," he murmured. "I'm here because I'm worried about you. This was never supposed to hurt you. It was supposed to help you grow." Daniel laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and empty. "Well, congratulations, I've grown. Now leave." But Edward didn't budge. "Sarah came to see me," he said softly. Daniel froze. "What?" he breathed. Edward nodded slowly. She told me she's leaving. For good." The words hit Daniel like a freight train. "No," he whispered, his heart pounding. "No, she wouldn't. She thinks she's holding you back," Edward continued gently. "She thinks she's ruining your life." Daniel's knees nearly gave out. "She's what?" "She's going back to her old job, back to her old life," Edward said softly. "She didn't want me to tell you, but I thought you deserved to know." Daniel felt like he was drowning. "Why?" he whispered hoarsely. "Why would she just leave?" Edward sighed, then stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Because she loves you," he murmured, "and she doesn't think you'll ever really be happy with her." The truth of it slammed into Daniel, nearly knocking him to his knees. She was leaving because she thought she was doing the right thing, because she didn't think he'd choose her. "But I do," he whispered fiercely, his hands trembling. "I do choose her." Edward's gaze softened. "Then go find her, son," he said quietly, "before it's too late." Daniel burst through the office doors, his heart pounding wildly. He knew where she would be. He knew her routine by now, the places she frequented, the route she took to and from work. It was early morning, and the streets were still waking up. He sprinted down the alleyways, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by, his only thought to reach her before it was too late. Finally, he spotted her, standing by a dumpster, dressed in her worn uniform, the garbage truck idling behind her. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes widening in shock. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice full of disbelief. "What are you—" "Don't go!" he blurted out, his chest heaving. He doubled over, gasping for breath, then straightened, meeting her gaze with a fierce determination. "Don't leave me, Sarah. Please." She blinked rapidly, confusion and pain flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked quietly. You thought I'd just let you walk away," he interrupted, stepping closer. "You thought I'd let you give up everything we've built together?" His voice cracked, raw and desperate. "I love you, Sarah, and I don't care if I'm rich or poor, if I'm working a garbage route or running a company. I don't care about any of it. I just want you." For a long moment, Sarah just stared at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Daniel, don't," she whispered. "Don't make this harder than it already is." He shook his head fiercely. "No, you're not doing this," he said, his voice breaking. "You're not leaving because you think I'll be better off without you. I won't. I'll be miserable, Sarah. I'll be empty." She looked away, her shoulders trembling. "Daniel, please." "No," he said firmly. "You listen to me. I don't care what my father wants or what anyone else thinks. I choose you. I choose you, Sarah, every day for the rest of my life, and if you walk away now, if you leave—" His voice dropped to a broken whisper. "I don't know what I'll do." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, her breath hitching painfully. "But your father—" "My father has nothing to do with this," Daniel said fiercely. "This is our decision, our life, and I want it with you." He reached out, cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. "Please, Sarah," he whispered, "don't go. Don't leave me. I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you, if that's what it takes." She gazed up at him, her heart breaking at the naked vulnerability in his eyes. You really mean that?" she whispered shakily. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "With everything I have," he murmured. For a long, agonizing moment, they just stood there, staring at each other, the world around them fading into a blur. Then, slowly, Sarah reached up, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "I love you too," she choked out, the words muffled against his shirt. I didn't want to hold you back." Relief surged through Daniel like a tidal wave. He closed his eyes, holding her tightly, his heart soaring. "You're not holding me back," he whispered fiercely. "You're making me better. You're everything to me, Sarah." They stood there for what felt like forever, wrapped in each other's arms, oblivious to the curious stares of their co-workers. and the rumble of the garbage truck engine. Finally, Daniel pulled back, his eyes searching hers. "Come with me," he whispered. She frowned slightly, confused. "Where?" He smiled. A slow, tender smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Anywhere," he murmured. "Everywhere. Just be with me. Let's build something new. Together." Sarah hesitated, her gaze flickering between his face and the truck behind her. The job that had been her lifeline for so long, the life she'd known. I don't know if I can just—" "You can," he interrupted softly, squeezing her hands. "We'll figure it out. We'll build a new life, one that's ours. Not my father's, not anyone else's, just ours." A small, incredulous smile tugged at her lips. "And what about your father's company? The business you're supposed to take over?" Daniel laughed softly, shaking his head. "I don't care about that," he murmured. "Not if it means losing you. I'll start over from scratch if I have to. As long as I have you, I have everything I need." Sarah's heart swelled, hope and love and disbelief swirling in her chest. "You really mean that?" she whispered. He nodded, his gaze steady. "I do," he said softly. "And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Okay, Daniel, let's build something together." He let out a shaky breath, his smile widening. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Sarah." And then he kissed her, softly, gently, as if she were something fragile and precious. The world around them seemed to melt away, leaving only the two of them, bound by a love stronger than any test or condition. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah glanced up at him, her eyes still bright with tears. "So, what now?" she asked softly. Daniel grinned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. "Now," he murmured, "we go tell my father that his plan backfired spectacularly." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You think he'll be upset?" "Maybe," Daniel admitted. "But I don't care, because you're worth it, Sarah. You're worth everything." He paused, his gaze turning serious. "And I promise you, I'll never let you forget that." A few days later, they stood hand in hand in Edward's office. The older man looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable as he took in their joined hands, the determined set of Daniel's jaw, the fierce love shining in Sarah's eyes. "So," he said quietly, "you've made your choice." "Yes," Daniel replied firmly, "and it's not about the money or the business or any of that. It's about her. It's always been about her." Edward was silent for a long moment, his gaze flickering between them. Then slowly he nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I see," he murmured. "And what do you plan to do now?" Daniel took a deep breath, then turned to Sarah, his eyes soft. "We're going to start our own business," he said quietly. "One that helps people like Sarah, people who work hard, who struggle, but don't get the opportunities they deserve." Edward raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "A waste management company?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, but more than that, a community-focused business, one that lifts people up, gives them a chance." Edward was silent for a long time, then slowly stood up, extending a hand. "In that case," he said softly, "I'd like to invest." The offer hung between them, unexpected and sincere. Daniel glanced at Sarah, who nodded slowly, a small hopeful smile on her lips. "Thank you," Daniel murmured, shaking his father's hand. "But we're doing this on our own terms." Edward nodded, his smile widening. "Of course," he said quietly. "And I'm proud of you, son, both of you." With that, Daniel and Sarah left the office, stepping out into the crisp morning air, hand in hand. They had a long road ahead, full of challenges and uncertainties, but they were together. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt truly, completely at peace. Have you ever had someone in your life put you to the test, challenging everything you thought you knew about yourself? What would you do if you were forced to choose between love and wealth? Do you think Edward's tough love was justified, or did he go too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have made the same choices Daniel did? And how do you define true wealth? Through money, status, or something deeper? Share your opinions with us. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to stay tuned for more stories like this one.